with one that's remote and it's in a time zone very, very far away. I don't know what time it is in Australia, but not a very convenient time. So we're going to start with a recorded video of Tatiana Lenz.
David, you got to do a share with audio.
I don't know. Are you?
When you do the screen share, you have to choose that you want to share the audio.
Sorry, technical difficulties.
Hi, my name is Tatiana Lenz and I'm from Legal Tech Helper. Today I just want to show you the project that we did last year with Mental Health Legal Centre. They're a CLC, a community legal centre here in Melbourne, Australia, and it's a kind of legal aid organisation. But its special remit is to help people with mental health challenges. And also CQU, the Central Queensland University, the law school there, helped us with the project as well. Let's just dive straight in. The first thing that users see is this splash screen. We're very lucky. We had a very talented illustrator who helped us refine the key concepts we wanted to get across to the users. And at the same time, to make the web illustration appealing and visually engaging. And she was able to follow our brief and create these images as SVGs. So SVG stands of course for Scalable Vector Graphics, and this has a couple of advantages. Firstly, SVG files are much smaller than raster files, and this means that they require much less bandwidth, and this in turn means that they can load more quickly, so users don't have to wait as long. And perhaps this is even more important, users who are in low socioeconomic groups, who are typically on low data plans, don't have to use quite so much of their data when using this web application. And another advantage is of course that the image size can be scaled across different devices without any loss of quality. Let me just quickly give you an idea of what it looks like on a mobile device. I just want to say too that we've sort of got this slide out menu on the mobile. We've got this help, so the urgent help has become just help in order to minimize screen real estate. So this kind of help button has become a sort of standard design pattern on sites that provide mental health information. So, and of course, if you are actually on a mobile, or let me just go back to the desktop screen. So if you're on a mobile or on a desktop or some other device that has some kind of integration, you can of course actually make the call from here as well. So yeah, I'll just quickly skip along, but I just want you to notice that there are a number of like introductory screens with quite simple navigation. So on this screen, we're telling them what the web application has to offer for them. There's also an important sort of statement. This is not legal advice and is not a substitute for legal advice. So we have what's legal information, which explains the difference between legal information and legal advice. So that's something that's actually quite important for the users to understand at some point, that they're not getting actual legal advice. It's a very strong distinction, at least here in our Australian jurisdiction, and nobody but lawyers can actually give legal advice. So that's just something to note there. And also we're telling them that they don't need to you do not need to tell us your name. So that's essentially letting the users know that they don't have to disclose their personal information. This is very, very important, both in terms of trust and also, these are very vulnerable clients, and, there is no need for us to keep this information. So yeah, we don't keep it. So yeah, just wanted to point that out. And then we have this screen, which is basically just saying it can be hard when you're trying to sort out problems, especially legal problems. And it was quite interesting. There was quite a lot of thought put into this. And in user testing, we actually were almost surprised by the strong emotions that this actually invoked in the users. And so it was really sort of important for us to empathise with them, and also in some ways to encourage them to go on. So we had these couple of introductory screens that have quite simple navigation. And now we go into, something that's a little bit more complex. So we have, some help. A person from a referring organisation could be a healthcare worker, support worker, social worker, a lawyer. We might not know the distinction between a family member and a family member who's a carer. So we have some help here, and also we have additional help here, which explains the care relationship a little bit more. We have external links which open up in new tabs, from authoritative sources. So here's one from the Victorian Department of Health, for instance. I'm just going to choose that I'm a family member. And then, we have this very explicit sort of map, and we have Victoria, the jurisdiction that we serve, highlighted here. So that's, visually like reinforcing to the user that this is sort of the target area. If they answer no, they still get some help, and I won't go into that, but it's less detailed help. But if they are living in Victoria, we'll say yes. They come to this more complex navigation, and if this was the first screen, I don't know that it wouldn't scare off some users. They'd be less willing to engage, but they've made it through a number of screens here, so they're more willing to kind of engage with this. So this is just a kind of accordion menu with some chips, multi-select chips that allow us to kind of identify the areas in which people need help in. So here we are echoing back what they've chosen. And, here we're saying we can't support you with this, but there are other services that you can use. Look, I'm just going to go through this very, very quickly. And then we have the other topic that they asked about, mental health hearings. So for instance, here we have these popovers. Again, reminding them what legal advice is. Unfortunately, just to save time, I'm going to have to, quickly go through this. So, what happens if, their family members in a high dependency unit or a prison, showing information. So, again, showing contact information, again, giving more services that can be that are there to help. Then this next steps, this is basically in a way we're echoing back the information that the users have received already, but in a different way, and we're actually doing it in terms of actionable steps. And then the session summaries. So we say that you can create a PDF file which summarizes the information that you got, and you can download the file and keep it for later, or email it to yourself, or print it. And so, for instance, it's very useful for organizations that might be having a session with their client, and then they can actually create a summary of the session for their clients and kind of physically hand it to them or email it to them. So let's just create that file. And this is the PDF file. It's actually quite minimal in terms of branding, and this is in order to help both in terms of, a lot of organizations worry about their using up their toner cartridges, so it can be printed in black and white and it still looks good. And also, we're using minimal amount of ink to but it still, looks good. And again, this is in a slightly different form, summarizing all the information for them, but, giving them critical information that they got, like, that, you have to ask your family member to contact us. They'll need to give their consent. This is where you can call us and reach us. These are the other services that can help. These are the problems that we can't help with, but here are, again, the other services for that particular problem. So, yeah. There's so much thought and care that was put into designing and building and validating this web application. Unfortunately, this is all we have time for. There is going to be a study that's going to be written up by the law school at CQU, the Central Queensland University. So look out for that. And if you want to reach out to me, I'm occasionally on the DOCACsemble Slack channel, or you can reach out to me directly at Tatiana at legaltechhelper.com.au. Thank you so much for giving us a chance to present here at DOCACON.
Great, thank you, Tatiana. And Tatiana is in the Zoom, but it's after midnight. Next up, we have Prakhar, who can hopefully share your screen.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, you're good.
Hello everyone, I am Advocate Prakhar Gupta. I am a practicing advocate. I was actually looking for certain tools which can automate the document assembly. That is when I came across DOCACON. In my initial days, as I was learning, through certain YouTube videos, I was able to generate certain documents using DOCACON. But as I wanted to dive deeper, it was difficult for me as I am from a non-technical background. I'm a practicing advocate. I don't have any tech knowledge. So this was a pretty big difficult part for me. Plus, it is difficult to get certain developer to learn this particular platform just for my purposes. That is when the ChatGPT came. And I saw certain YouTube videos again that ChatGPT can be used for the purposes of generating code. That is when I thought of using ChatGPT for the purposes of generating code for the DOCACON. That is how this particular theme started. And today I am going to showcase you a bit how I used that ChatGPT platform to actually generate code for DOCACON. So this is ChatGPT platform. I hope you can see the new screen. So in the first prompt, I have simply asked them to generate a rent agreement for me. I have not given them any specific information. Although this is for the illustration purposes, I have used it with actual Word files wherein I have put my actual agreements. And in the next step, what I have done is I have asked the ChatGPT to identify all the relevant variables in the same. And I have given it link to Jinja platform, the documentation thereof. And I have asked it to identify the relevant variables. Once I did it, it identified all the relevant variables, which can be taken as an input from the user. So this was my step one, wherein I have given it a Word file. Now, based on the Word file, it is able to identify the variables which I want. Then I again asked it to regenerate the whole document with the variable names. So now, as you can see, that it has replaced actual document with the variables which we can actually use while generating document using DOCACON. So this was one of the first interesting observations I made. And you can actually copy paste it and save it in a Word file to be used as a template at a later stage. Now, once I was done with it, I needed second part of help, that is generating the document. So for that particular purposes, from the last example, like it gave me the column of date and landlord. For the example purposes, I took only 5, but it even works with a longer range of variables. These variables were generated by ChatGPT. This is the first screen of the prompt. It is a bit longer prompt. So I copy pasted what all variables and the questions I wanted to ask. Then I asked the ChatGPT to generate a DocAssemble interview for the above variable using the documentation below. So in this particular example, what I have done is I have actually taken the real code from the scene, but you can also utilize it using documentation. You can give the link for documentation, which I will show at a later time. So I have explained to the ChatGPT, this is the format of how the question must look like. And I have explained how this, what particular thing signifies what. So once I was able to do that, it generated some sort of interview which looked like this. So herein you can see that the date of agreement is in all of them are in a like normal variable. They are not specific to what we kind of desired them. So I generated a second set of prompt. That is, following is the documentation for date as a variable. Following which it generated another response. I copy pasted it and run it. So this particular time, the agreement, the date of agreement could be turned into a date form. Similarly, this is one of the applications of how ChatGPT can be used. Other applications which I found is generally when, as an advocate, I try to formulate an interview. I think from a perspective of a technical person, like someone who is not a lay person. But whilst in designing an interview, many a times it is possible that I might oversee how a how a layperson might not be able to appreciate the technical term which I might have used, uh, So ChatGPT can again help you framing those questions in a better manner. Variable identification is there something I have shown that how variables can be identified in a Word document or in any format which you want to generate an interview for. And third part can be looking for the document analysis and implementation. The example I showed is of a document implementation, whereas ChatGPT can also help you identify what particular part of the documentation you might want to apply. So it might be again a different kind of thing, like where you just simply write to ChatGPT that this particular thing is of date format. Here lies the documentation. You don't need to identify the specific part. The ChatGPT can then suggest you that you can use this particular thing. So I have tried this particular thing with the recipes section in documentation, wherein it identified certain thing. It actually suggested. So these are the possible use cases. I hope these use cases might help you delve deeper how ChatGPT can be used with DOCACON to actually make a better legal services and social services. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, there was one question in the chat. Do you see it?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, Bryce asked, did you experiment?
Actually,
parts
if
of
you
the
give a very particular or a...
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So if you give a very specific set of very specific thing, like if you are like in this particular example, as I showed, I gave it a very specific part of the date, wherein I said this is how documentation for date must work. In those cases, it was really, really accurate. But in other times when I just gave it a reference to the whole page, it took 2 or 3 more prompts to get to those results. So definitely, if you give an exact part which you want to replicate, you might get a better result in lesser prompts. But it otherwise also works with 3 to 4 more prompts.
We have a question from the in-person room. Go ahead.
Did you try any of this with Bing's chat?
I haven't tried with Bing chat as of yet. I have tried with ChatGPT only. And GPT 3.5 is also not very accurate. GPT 4 is somewhere you can actually see real interviews that can exactly be copy pasted from the ChatGPT for the purposes of DOCACON.
Second question, if I may, do you know what the limit is for giving GPT the online link saying, hey, see this link and the documentation of this link? Is there a limit there? As in, the question that comes to my mind is, why not just give it the entire DocAssemble documentation? Will it follow sublinks, for instance?
Actually, if you try to give it multiple links, it gets confused. So it is not able to give you accurate result which you might be desiring. So although it might work with multiple links, but it might not be so accurate, because as I mentioned earlier, when you give a link to the whole page, it works, but it takes much more prompts. But if you give a specific link, it works much more accurately and much more in a much more faster way.
Any other questions from the room? All right, thanks so much. That was a fascinating presentation. We're going to move on to Jason Morris.
Hey, everybody, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. And you can see the screen?
We can.
Awesome. Have the technology. Okay, so I'm Jason. I'm here to talk about doing rules as code with Blawx for trustworthy, explainable legal AI. This is a really quick version, but you got all my contact information there. So please do get in touch with me if you have any deeper questions for afterwards. So what is rules as code? This is a diagram that kind of shows how you might build a Docassemble interview using rules as code and Blawx. But essentially the idea is that you take what you know about your legislation and you compartmentalize it. You set it out in a separate system with custom built tools that are designed to make an encoding of just the rules that is powerful and possible for non-programmers to read, use, and validate. And then your app developer doesn't actually need to know what the rules are in order to build a Docassemble interview that complies with them. They just need to know what data to collect and what API your rules server is using. And the main advantage is that this encoding, particularly if it was made by the people who wrote the rule in the first place, that encoding can be reused across multiple different projects. It can be maintained and improved centrally without requiring any changes to the front-end applications that rely on it, as long as the data interface hasn't changed. So in Blawx, which is a tool, prototypical tool that I'm working on for doing rules as code, the way that you start is with the text of the actual law written in a markdown-like language that I've developed called clean. That gets converted into a hierarchical structure in legal DocML, which is also known as Acomo Entoso, which is a standard XML for legislation and similar types of documents. And that hierarchical structure then serves as the outline of your code. So instead of putting your code into files, you're just putting code into the sections of the law one by one. Each section is encoded one by one in this kind of a graphical, Blockly-based visual interface. And the reason for that is that it makes it a little easier to learn, but most importantly, it acts as a kind of controlled natural language. So people who aren't writing the code can still read it. The code is effectively legible for people who don't know the programming language. And you can see that Blawx's coding features have got things that are designed to mimic the structure of actual laws, like exceptions and applicability. These sorts of things help to maintain the one-to-one relationship between pieces of code and pieces of law, and that in turn makes the code easier to read, write, validate, and maintain. It also ensures that when you ask the software to explain its answer, it has a section of legislative text that corresponds to every section of code. The next main feature of Blawx is this thing called the scenario editor, which gives a user-friendly interface for non-programmers, so maybe your lawyers or other subject matter experts, to experiment with the encoding and see how it behaves. It's a little unusual compared to a lot of computing systems that tend to use a closed world assumption. This allows you to say that certain statements are true. It allows you to say that certain statements are false. It allows you to say that certain statements are unknown or uncertain, and it allows you to say things about particular objects or about entire categories of objects. So for example, here, it is uncertain whether any person was a pensioner on July 1st, 1977. That's an uncertain statement about a category of object. So when you express uncertainty like this, Blawx is able to hypothesize and will generate answers based on assumptions about those uncertainties, and then we'll tell you what assumptions it made in order to find the answer. So this is really a lot more like how lawyers think about rules than is typical for a lot of systems out there. So the scenario editor, when you've asked a question, it will generate natural language explanations for all of the answers that it can reach, and for each different way in which that same answer can be reached. So in this way, you know not only whether or not your Blawx encoding got you the right answer or answers, but you also know whether it got you those answers for the right reasons and only for the right reasons. And this is a feature that's basically not available in any other user-friendly tool for doing this sort of thing. So this is how you would generate the code. This is how you would have it validated by an expert. So now let's imagine you've got an encoding. What do you do with it? Well, you can create an API by encoding a question. And this is what encoding a question looks like. So you would just create these three blocks together and then give that a name and save it. Now you've got an API. And You can then create your DocAssemble interview, and I have a DocAssemble interview set up to do exactly this. There's a link to it later. You can download it and try it yourself, but it will collect the relevant information, and then you have to reformat that information into the JSON package shape that Blawx is expecting. You send that package to the Blawx endpoint, and it returns an answer. This is an example of the raw text of the answer that Blawx will return to you. It's relatively complicated because Blawx has got a lot of internals that are going on in order to deal with exceptions and things like that. So this can be kind of overwhelming to give to the average user. But with the advent of LLM, we can throw this stuff into something like GPT-4 and ask it to summarize. And if you throw this raw into GPT-4 and ask for a short summary, this is what you get. So even if the output of Blawx isn't really great for people to read, it's great for GPT-4 to read, and GPT-4 can generate something that your users can read really well. So why would we do it like this? Why would we use rules as code for app development? Well, if you've got a validated encoding and it's published and you use it to develop your app, you get something that's accurate, trustworthy, explainable, transparent, accountable, plain language, maintainable, and easy to build. And if you don't care about any of those things, then maybe it isn't for you. Those are all of the links. I will be happy to share all of this. And I love doing demos. So please get in touch if this is something that you have an audience that would be interested in seeing. And yeah, that's it for me. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions for Jason? Yes, there's one question in the Zoom chat where Tatiana asks, is there a reason you chose Blawx instead of OpenFisca?
Yeah, great question. So OpenFisca, for those of you who might not be familiar, is another rules as code tool out there. It's essentially a Python library, and it targets something called micro simulation. So the idea is you take your rule and you encode it, and then you can simulate a lot of different people in an economy or different families or businesses, and you can do statistical sampling of what a change in legislative policy would do to economic outcomes. So you can see if there are like marginal tax rate cliffs or something that you're generating. So it's very, very useful for micro simulation. The issue with OpenFisca, and really with almost everything that doesn't use a declarative method, is that if you have a rule and the rule isn't going to change, then you can generate it into OpenFisca and you can run it and you're happy. If what you need to do is you need to maintain an encoding alongside a law or laws that are changing, the fact that laws are written declaratively and OpenFisca is written imperatively causes the maintaining of the code to be more expensive than the maintaining of the law. So the reason that I developed Blawx is because when you're using a declarative encoding, you maintain that one-to-one relationship between sections of the law and sections of the code. And when you have that one-to-one relationship, you get a bunch of advantages. It's easier for subject matter experts to look at a Blawx encoding and know that it's correct because they can actually read the code. They can't read OpenFisca usually. And then when a particular section of a rule changes, only the corresponding section of the code needs to change in Blawx. And so it's a lot more maintainable when the legislation changes. So OpenFisca has got a lot of features that Blawx doesn't have, but that's the main feature that Blawx does have. And I see Michelle's question. Yes, it is open source under MIT, and there's a GitHub link, and I will share links in the chat for the slides so that you can check out the slides and get access to all the other links as well.
And in the room, Jonathan Petz has a question.
Hey, Jason, this was really, really interesting. I'm curious, a lot of people in this DOCACON community are sort of in the legal aid world. What do you see as the biggest use cases for Blawx at creating products in that world?
Sorry, I didn't hear just the end of that question. The biggest use cases in
the legal aid world for Blawx.
Right. I mean, it's difficult to kind of, honestly, we're still kind of exploring our way through what the use cases are. As I show it to people, I'm working inside the government of Canada right now. And as I show it to people inside the government of Canada, they keep coming up with use cases for it that I would never have anticipated. We had one department that used it to do an experiment to determine whether or not it was worth writing a regulation, because it allowed them to simulate what percentage of their clients' questions would actually be answered by that regulation. And if the percentage was too low, then they weren't going to bother. So I have difficulty predicting use cases. In legal aid, the obvious thing that jumps out to me is eligibility regulations can be kind of complicated, and legal aid organizations spend a lot of time trying to triage people just to figure out if they can even help them. That's an obvious place where you could encode your eligibility rules and have that set aside and updated by experts inside your legal aid department who don't need to be programmers. And then your DOCACsemble interview would always be completely up to date about what the current rules are for eligibility. And so that's an obvious use case for legal aid. But honestly, it's really difficult to find a limit to the number of places that you could usefully use it.
That's awesome. Thank you.
There's another
Thank you.
question in the room as well.
Hi, Jason. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I work in criminal law, and the immediate use case I see here is using this with LLMs to review voluminous like discovery. So say you have a revocation of probation, you've got a 700-page chronology of everything that happened during that person's probation. And then you've got the rule for what the basis for the revocation is. Have you done anything like used it for that purpose? So you would use the output of the rule as the prompt and then run it against the 700 pages, assuming you can do that and maintain privacy for your client.
Yeah, we haven't gotten to the point of kind of attempting to collect inputs for a rule from documents that are being processed by LLM or anything like that. It's certainly something that would be worth exploring, but we haven't gotten that far. The places that I've been playing along with LLMs is literally yesterday, I discovered that GPT-4 is smart enough to actually generate the JSON packages that Blawx's API uses from a natural language conversation with a person. So that scenario editor that I showed you, 6 months from now, that will probably not exist, and that will be a natural language chatbot interface. And it will literally just ask the person, so what's your situation? And they will type in the situation and it will generate the JSON package. So that's one place we're looking at using it. Another, in this demonstration I showed, Blawx generates very complicated explanations, and LLMs are good at simplifying complex text. So that's the second place. And then the third place that we're currently exploring is whether GPT-4, if we organize it in a particular way, would be capable of generating a first draft of the encoding on the basis of legislative text. And that's something that generating semantic formalisms from legal text is a thing that no AI system has been smart enough to do yet. So we're kind of exploring that and seeing if we've gotten there. But that's kind of where our focus is. In terms of generating the inputs, there's a lot of work for people to do there, and probably some very interesting things that you could find.
Great, thank you so much. Next up, we have Caroline Robinson.
Video.
Hello.
Share screen. Right.
Yeah, we can hear you. It's a little quiet.
I have to be a little bit quiet because everybody in my house is asleep. So.
Caroline is in Alaska.
Okay. so why? Oh, I see. Okay, all right. So in Alaska, I just moved to Alaska in June, and we were using Docassemble to do something called guided assistance. And I'm just going to show you the end result because I'm going to show you something about the code. The idea of the guided assistance is to ask a number of questions and then give people an action plan at the end. Right now we're just working in family law. And this is an action plan for changing, I'm just going to say changing a child support order in Alaska. So the idea is that when you get to the end, you actually can have you have these little accordions. I'm just going to minimize our so the other thing, I don't know if you can, if you see me, I'm going to go back to my screen. I slipped on the ice last Wednesday, broke my wrist, and I have to see a surgeon today. So it's my mouse hand wrist, and the screens are not doing what I want them to do because I'm trying to use my left hand. And I have a feeling that I may have just closed the window that I took a few minutes to get to. I did. I've lost that window because I'm left-handed. I mean, I'm not left-handed. So let me just see if I can find it again. I don't know if you saw that screen long enough. Oh, maybe I can get it back by doing you can, let me just give me 1 second. Yes, okay. All right. So we end up at the end asking a series of questions that we end up with these accordions so that people can actually get their action plan on the final screen, and then they can print they can print a PDF to get the full thing. But this way it's much easier to digest step by step, and it looks simpler, and then they can get the PDF. However, as you may know or not know, with family law, there are many, many conditions, and that's what they are, conditions. So if this is true, then if this is true, then if this is true. So you end up with these nested ifs. And now I'll go back to the other screen where I can show you this. So what I ended up doing is, first of all, you have your interview order block in a typical YAML file. And I ended up seeing, so here's an if, we've got an else, then we've got an if underneath that, an if underneath that, an if underneath that, then an elif, and then you keep going else. And so I myself was getting to the point where I was really lost, and I couldn't even know, I was like 7 ifs in, and then there was an elif, and then there was an else, and I was thinking, where am I? And even if you put this on VS Code or Notepad++, you get really lost. Because I was doing those accordion steps, those collapsible templates, I had my interview order, and then I had another YAML that was built just producing a little template for each of these conditions. But you can see once again, I have many, many nested ifs, and I was getting very confused. So Michelle, who you showed you about the testing earlier, helped me break this down. And I think I'm going to go to another interview. This is changing child custody. So that actually each one of these ifs is its own little, these are several ifs, but they break them down. So I don't have, each little block is an if and not this nested if. So you have each little condition step on its own little block. And that has made a huge difference. That's all I wanted to show you, because I was getting these I was getting these nested ifs, and I didn't know where to go. And my son, who is a programmer, I am not a programmer, but my son is a programmer, would just kind of be so disgusted with me and saying, "Oh, Mom, this is terrible." And I kept coming to the DOCACsemble group saying, "I have these really complicated if statements. I don't know what to do with them." So this is what Michelle helped me do, is make these little separate blocks for each if. And the other thing that's really cool about this, it's only because we're doing these accordion steps at the end, but these little if blocks mean that I don't have to do this complicated if statements in the interview order. So I'm only doing my interview order in one place, not in two places, where this is the parent file where I have to do the interview order. Then I had to go to the accordion steps to build, I call it accordion steps. This is your template to build another complicated set of ifs, which are just duplicating the interview order. And then, so this is a third. This is changing child custody. I'm showing the example of the changing child support. That's all I had to show you. This is my spreadsheet, which shows all the hierarchy of the ifs. So I use this anyway. The other thing that this really helps me with in terms of creating these little steps is that when I do the test, which I've been growing with Michelle through the steps of testing, is that it helped me build all my tests as well. So there they are, all in here. So that's just another way to do your interview order. If you have these nested ifs, is to break them up into separate blocks. And if you are going to do this kind of have this result of the templates at the end, you can put them in a separate file, and you actually have a set of if conditions that somebody else can read. I'm sorry if I've gone through this too quickly, but I'm doing it last minute with a broken wrist. So I think I can stop sharing them.
Great. Are there any questions on Zoom or in the room? No? All right, seeing none, we will move on to another time zone. There's some applause for it. We'll move on to another time zone. Richard Copley is in the UK, I believe. He'll be coming on next.
Okay, good afternoon from the UK. Good morning where you are. Can you hear me?
We can hear you and we can see your screen.
Excellent. This was tagged as writing EU regulations as code. It's actually more about turning regulations into code. And I'm a novice in Docassemble and Python. And this was triggered by the pandemic and the behavior of the airlines in Europe to their customers as flights got cancelled. It was also triggered by the work that Jason Morris has done. And I didn't realize Jason was talking today, but a couple of years ago, I followed a lot of what he was doing and tried to understand it. But what you're going to see is what happens when a non-lawyer, non-developer, and somebody who does not know as much as Jason starts messing about with complex regulations. So denied boarding is a piece of EU legislation that governs how airlines are supposed to deal with cancellations, delays, overfull flights, and passengers who've been downgraded from their booked class. And the eligibility for this compensation and remedy is complex, but basically the flight must either start in the EU or it must land in the EU and be on an EU airline. And the key remedies are either you get reimbursed and returned to your point of origin, or you get rerouted to where you thought you were going to be going. And in addition to the remedy, there is additional compensation that may be payable, but that is based on a whole bunch of factors like flight distance, the severity of delay, length of notice of the cancellation in the first place, a whole series of things. By background, I'm a systems analyst. I start nearly everything with a data model, and this is the data model for denied boarding. I've simplified it down a bit for today, but it's important, I think, when you look at a piece of regulation which is written in English, to try and turn it into something a bit more semantically tight, that defines the terms that are used in that regulation and occur frequently. And these are the main things that occur in denied boarding. And in terms of process model, and it goes a bit to what I think Caroline was talking about earlier, this is not a process map to describe the regulation. It's a set of decision trees supported by a set of decision tables. So all my documentation is decision trees and decision tables. There are 4 discrete interviews in the suite that I've sort of built, one for each aspect of the denied boarding regulations. I thought about combining these into a single interview. Actually, it turns out there is not much benefit in doing that, and some significant downside in the complexity of the logic and trying to find the endpoints. Because one of the problems is that these being regulations, they have multiple endpoints, both valid conditions and invalid conditions. So I've broken the interviews down into 3 sets. Of each interview actually is 3 interviews. One is the questions, one is the template text taken out of the regulation that gives you the help and definitions, and the third one is a set of endpoint events, which are conditionally called by the progress of the interview questions. And this is all supplemented by a load of Python modules, 14 in total so far, that actually do all the heavy lifting. So I'm going to give you a demo, but it's not I can't pretend it's an interesting demo, because all the interesting stuff is going on underneath the demo in the Python work. But the Python, for example, calculates the eligibility for compensation, the eligibility for remedies. It calculates the compensation, the adjustments to compensation based on various factors. It calculates the distances between airports, which turns out to be important, although, like all regulations, not necessarily well defined. So I'm going to try and switch screens now. So if you bear with me. You should now be able to see an interview. There is nothing presentationally interesting about the interview. It is in standard DOCACsemble. Basically, it goes through the regulation. It checks that the tickets are eligible for compensation. Let's assume they are. It checks on where the flight started and ended, and who ran it, because that turns out to be a factor. I'm going to make this start in France and end in Canada. If it started in Canada and ended in France, it would not be valid. Going to add some detail about flight numbers, departure airport. This only now selects departure airports that are actually in France. I'm going to pretend that this flight was on the 9th of March, and it was going to leave at 1600 hours. It was going to go to Calgary. Somebody has to go to Calgary. Same day, and it was going to land, given the time difference, 2 hours locally. So it then asks a question about the cancellation, and it depends how far in advance of cancellation you're notified as to whether you get compensation. More than 14 days, all bets are off. But I'm going to make this just within a narrow window of 4 or 5 days before. And Article 8 sets out that if your flight is cancelled, you have to have one of these 2 remedies. I'm going to choose rerouting because that's more interesting. And let's pretend that we got rerouted now from Orly in Paris on a different flight. We still went to Calgary. We went on the same day, Well, let's say no, we routed the day after. And we went at 20:01 in the evening. We landed at 21:01 local time. We weren't delayed overnight. Let's pretend we weren't. And it gives some conclusions. I should caveat this by saying this is not legal advice, because I am by no stretch of the imagination a lawyer, although I have worked with many, but I'm not one myself. So it sets out the conclusions about what the original flight was, what happened to that flight, what the remedy was in terms of rerouting, how far the flight was in terms of kilometers, and how much compensation was calculated. And that compensation would have been reduced by half had the delays in the rerouting been smaller. And that's part of the Python program underneath that calculates all those different things. So that's a very, very simple view of what I've done. And I have more slides, but in the interest of time, and given that we're now well into the break, I'm probably going to stop there and see if there are any questions.
Okay, any questions in the chat? There is a question in the room.
For your fields for first name, last name, and flight, did you use code to populate those choices?
Did you hear the question?
No, I heard the question. I think are you saying because you told me fill things in from drop downs, they're just remembered fields, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I did use code, for example, in places like the departure and arrival airports based on the departure and arrival countries. So there's a dictionary somewhere that I use that works out which airports are in which countries. That's complicated in Europe by things like Malmo in Sweden, which is used as an airport for Copenhagen in Denmark by Ryanair. But that complication apart, that dictionary does work.
All right. No more questions. So thanks very much. And last but not least, we have Michael.
Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen. All right, so you should all be able to see my screen. My name is Michael Hofrichter. I'm the project team lead over at Legal Server. We use DOCACsemble internally for the most part. And I had started using DOCACsemble back in this 2019 or so for some various projects with the legal aid that I was with then. And my experience with DOCACsemble has all been about figuring out my own coding strategy, because I was an accidental techie. Like, I went to law school and then I ended up doing all of this stuff. So I wanted to talk about how to develop on your local machine, some suggestions for that, and some tools to make that useful and functional for you. So today we're going to talk a little bit about best practices, about why you would want to do this. We'll take a look at the tools that I'm using. I will say that my process is not necessarily the best process. It's the process that I found that works for me. And any of these situations, you're going to want to figure out what's the right set of tools for you. I'll also talk a little bit about how to configure the different tools to work together, and then what my ongoing process is for this. So the real benefit, and this is a lot of text, but the real benefit here is when you're working on your local machine, you can work on multiple files at once. You can work on multiple packages at once. Projects have linting capabilities, right? And that's when they, if you're looking at VS Code or some other code browser, like, it'll shade the text in different colors because this is a key versus a value, or it will underline some of the code going like, we don't recognize this variable, you haven't defined it yet, right? And so that linting saves you from having to run it and then Python giving you back an error going undefined variable, right? If your editor was telling you about some of this, so you can fix it earlier. DOCACsemble's playground does have some of that. I think a lot of that was added after I had already switched away from using the playground to add some of that those features, but you've got more options elsewhere. The other thing is that I've often found, especially before COVID, that when I was traveling was a great time to do a lot of code work because I had like 3 hours uninterrupted on the plane and no one was going to bother me, which is often rare. And so editing offline was really important, right? And this is one of the things that you can do when you're working locally. There are some limitations, however, right? So if you're using Docker locally on a new Mac that's got one of the M1, M2 chips, you have to have an ARM image. Not everything's compatible with an ARM. If you're working locally, you're going to have a config file on that local server, and it's going to have to tie in to any of those other integrations. So a lot of my projects tend to have a Google Drive component. I know Jonathan talked about this earlier. I tend to store a lot of my templates in Google Drive because that's my editor of choice for docx files, and that also makes it available to all of my coworkers to make changes to those files. But that means that I can't actually work offline anymore, right? Because I can only work offline so much. I can't actually test it because then it can't reach out to Google Drive, grab that file, and do what it needs to do. So there are some limitations here. I also am a huge fan of the AL Kiln features. I've bugged Michelle about them a bunch and figured out how to run them on my own servers and gotten them working. And most of my interviews at this point have AL Kiln tests that go along with them. And when I write a new Python function, right, I'm also typically writing an AL Kiln test for them, just so that I know that it exists and it's working and I'm getting back the responses that I want to get back, right? And I know Michelle quoted me in her slides. Like, one of the big things there is that I want to know if the API responses change and I have to fix something, rather than a end user telling me, hey, I can't use your interview anymore, it stopped working. This happened last week with a Jira upgrade, right? We upgraded Jira and then suddenly the API response stopped working. I also really recommend that when you're setting up your development and testing environment, that you have something that closely matches your production environment, right? The same cloud hosting, the same storage backup, etc. Right? You can develop on your local machine that is all local storage, but then have a testing platform that's going to interact with S3 if your production server is also interacting with S3. And the reason that I'm saying that is that occasionally you'll find some edge case bug that only happens when you're connecting to S3. And you want to know about that before you hit that on your production server, right? You want to know that this is going to be an issue. This is going to be a problem for me. I've got to figure out an update first, right? And so, for example, legal server said that we needed to use secure server-side encryption in S3, right? And we turned that on, and I did a poor job at a pull request to Jonathan about enabling that in Docassemble, and I realized I missed a whole bunch of things in that. And then Jonathan went back and got it working, and then it turned out that our production server was the wrong version of Debian to support the latest version of Docassemble that then also did server-side encryption. So it was an interesting set of variables that we couldn't see until we started testing with an environment that was the same as our production environment. All right, so coming back, let me talk about the tools that I've been using in terms of this, right? I've been using GitHub Desktop, right? Because I'm coming from a non-coding perspective. So GitHub Desktop has that UI that I can easily work with. VS Code, I know Bryce talked about this earlier. I've been using the Docassemble command line interface. That is something that Jonathan wrote, I think, probably for his own use, but then I started using it as well. And it makes updating from within VS Code to your Docassemble server really simple. Docker, obviously, to run it locally, and then Google Drive. There is a Google Drive sync. That's sort of the gateway into coding with VS Code or something else like that, is using the Google Drive sync to sync your playground locally. Right. Once you have a better workflow, it's probably not the best one overall. It works well for basic environment. If you're working with multiple packages or on multiple servers, you'll want something more robust. In terms of GitHub Desktop, right, the nice thing is that once you've got that authenticated, you can also link it to your preferred external editor, right, Visual Studio Code in this case, and that can tie together. When you're installing VS Code, there's probably going to be some extensions that you'll want to add. When you open up VS Code and you open up a file, it'll often go like, hey, do you want to add this little extension down in the bottom corner? And so the ones that I tend to use are these 5, but there's other ones as well. And VS Code also has in like a built-in functionality to clone your Git repository and to track source control modifications. And so that's really, really helpful. I realize that I'm sort of speeding through these processes, but there is a great workflow that Dele, and I can't pronounce his last name, wrote up for Quentin's Docassemble documentation. I have a link in one of the notes on my slide deck about that. That's a great way in terms of how to set up Windows subsystem for Linux and how to set up VS Code and how to get all of those pieces working together. Right, and it talks about some of these pieces as well, right? Docassemble CLI is the next tool in here as well. You'll need Python, you'll need pip. Pip can be somewhat of a hassle on a Mac. So if you're installing it, there's some workarounds. Again, I've got a link in my slide deck notes. And then once you've installed Docassemble CLI, you have to then tell Docassemble CLI, where are my Docassemble servers? And so in this case, right, if you do a da install-add, it'll ask you what's your server URL, what's your API key, and then it'll save that. You can have multiple servers, though, connected to Docassemble CLI. So you can have your localhost server, you can have your testing server, you can have your production server, and be able to push your documentation to any one of those 3 things, or multiple servers. When you're looking at the Docassemble configuration in Docker locally, Dele suggested using a Docker compose file, and he shares one in his documentation. I've come back and stripped that down, and so this is what I've used when I'm testing things locally. The nice thing here is that it's got a Docker volume, so it's a local piece of information, and so that gets saved locally. So that's my config file, my configurations, right? That all sticks around. And then I've also got in here, right, that I'm in Chicago and not Africa. I'm on this time zone, right? So that some of those basics are happening here as well. Once this is up, right, you can then just manage this in Docker, right? You can say, start this Docker instance, stop this Docker instance, restart this Docker instance, and it'll all be there for you. The nice thing here is that I've got this set to restart. I've got this set to have a grace period when stopping, right? The standard commands that I would have when I'm opening a Docker instance before. The nice thing about using the Docker compose file, right, which is this Docker compose YAML on the left here, is that this gives me a really easy command line to run, as opposed to the really long Docker sentences that you end up running when you're launching a new Docker instance normally. All right, so those are the tools. A little bit about my sort of development process when I'm going through this. Step one is to clone the repository locally, right? From GitHub, I clone it, I've got a local copy. I then want to modify it in VS Code, however I want to modify it. I can then push it to Docassemble. And then if I then switch to Docassemble, reload the playground, I can hit save and run to test that interview. I can then tweak this and repeat and repeat and repeat. And then when I'm ready, I can commit it to GitHub. So, right, if I'm using the Google Drive sync, right, I'll see the files here instead. Google Drive sync has a weird structure where all of the modules for all of the packages are in one subfolder. And then all of the questions are in one subfolder, each with the different pieces in other subfolders. But it's not quite the same thing that you end up getting with GitHub. Right? With GitHub, you've got all of my files for this specific repository, all of my files for this package in one place. You can open that, you can clone it, you can then open it in Visual Studio Code, and then you get to see all of those files linked together on the side here, right? And I can see all of these files. And this is actually one of the tests that I've got that's attached to this, where I'm identifying, setting up a whole bunch of variables and tapping to continue and all of those things. The nice thing here is that Visual Studio Code will let you update multiple files. I can update multiple pieces of this. And one of the things that I've done for a lot of my work is that I've moved a lot of my Python code into a shared package. So if I end up coming across something where I need to update that shared package, when I was just working in the browser, I'd have to switch projects, switch over to that. I couldn't then just test my new package, right? I had to then install my new package so that my links from my second package would work with my first package. And so that ended up being a lot of work to do when I was just working in the browser. Once I came to working in VS Code, I could update both packages at the same time, modify both repositories, make those changes, and then make sure that they all worked. The other really nice thing about VS Code, and this is probably because I'm not a Python developer by training or anything else like that, is that I really appreciate the terminal. I really appreciate being able to test the terminal. And I think I've got an idea of how I built out this, all of these if statements. And so one of the things that I did is I went into the terminal. I was like, all right, well, I'm going to import JSON and I'm going to run my, and I'm going to step through each line of my Python script and just test it out there and see, is this working? Am I getting any client names in my client name list, right? Is that all happening? And as I go through it, it's going to give me a name error. And like, look, you typed out requests wrong or anything else like that. And so I can then see all of these different details and make sure that my code is right before I send it over to Docassemble and then hit save and continue, and then have to debug it there, right? Because again, if I'm worried about the Python code and I'm trying to test it in Docassemble, right, those are two different windows. When I'm hitting save and run, I don't typically also have the Python code open in the same screen. Lastly, right, I can continually test on Docassemble as often as I need it. So you can see here, right, I pushed the project and it installed, and then I pushed it again, and then I pushed it again. And I can just keep pushing it as long as I need to, as I keep tweaking step by step by step. Lastly, I've got the ability to then finally commit it to GitHub when I'm ready to do that. And theoretically, that'll kick off any of your AL Kiln tests if you're using AL Kiln. And then you can then see, right, what happened, did everything work, right? Clearly, it wasn't working because, right, I had to manually fix an endpoint. And then since then, it's been working. And so one of the things that I've often done is I've tried to say, here are my, here are my tests. I know that they're working. One of the reasons that I've been talking with Michelle lately has been to get the AL kiln tests working on my local machine. And I think she's close, and it works, but it doesn't completely work for everything I need. But that means that I can then run those tests without having to push it off to GitHub and circle back that way. So that's some thoughts about the a development process when you're working with DocAssemble, working through the different places and the different pieces. There's a bunch of moving parts, which is always frustrating and daunting sometimes. But once you've got everything enabled, it's really easy to just cycle through the loops of development and testing and pushing it forward. So I hope this is helpful to newer coders or anyone else, and open to any questions.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions in the room? All right, we've been hearing presentations for a while. Thank you very much, Michael. But it's about time for a break. So let us reconvene at 11:30 in about 9 minutes.